We have to remember how the situation in Lebanon, how it began and how it unfolded. So let's start with the basic facts. Iran was the victim of probably the most brazen, flagrant, egregious breach of the UN Charter in modern history. The war of aggression that was launched against it. There's no comparison, in my opinion. Even before the UN Charter, even before the UN Charter, you take the Nazis in 1939 when they invaded Poland. They fabricated a border incident. It was a fake, but they knew they had to have some justification for invading Poland. You had to have some sort of justification. Even the Nazis recognized that fact. It was a fabricated border incident, but you know, the expression hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. And here there's a variation of it. They recognized that they had to have some pretext to justify the attack. When the U.S. Uh, increased its involvement in the war in Vietnam with ground troops, President Johnson, LBJ, as he was called, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he fabricated the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You are too young to remember it, but that was a turning point in the war. The Gulf of Tonkin, it was claimed that a North Vietnamese vessel had attacked an American vessel. Turned out to be false. But that commenced a major escalation in the U.S. war in Vietnam. It was called, for the sake of your listeners, those who are interested, it was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which signaled a major escalation in the war. They needed a pretext. They needed a pretext. There was no pretext in the case of Iran, none. It was so brazen, so flagrant, so egregious, the assault on Iran. At that point, there was no longer any laws of war. They had gone. I had already written in November 2025, I had already written that when the UN Security Council handed Donald J. Trump the deed to Gaza, that's what it did. Very few people know it because they haven't read Resolution 2803. Resolution 28, UN Security Council Resolution 2803 gave the deed of Gaza to Donald J. Trump, a retarded ape. They gave him the deed to Gaza. At that point, I wrote, the UN is now a rotting corpse. When the US and Israel invaded, I should say, US and Israel launched a war of aggression against Iran. If you read the Security Council, the emergency hearings, they were breathtaking. If you listened to those hearings, as I didn't read them yet. If you listened to them, it was as if Iran was the aggressor. It was as if Iran was the aggressor. The Russian representative, and I don't always quote the Russians, but in this case, the Russian said, it's as if the British and the French are living in a parallel universe. He described it as, going back to Alice in Wonderland, the sequel book was called, it was as if through the looking glass. It was completely insane. You're blaming Iran? This was the most brazen, flagrant, egregious breach of the UN Charter in modern history, even preceding the Charter. And you're blaming Iran? At that point, there was no longer a rule of law. We had returned to what the philosophers in the 19th century called, we had returned to the state of nature, where everybody is responsible only to themselves to preserve their life against what John Locke called the wild beasts. The wild beasts. And Iran was now attacked by two wild beasts, unconstrained by law, unconstrained by any sense of morality, two wild beasts. Now, in that situation, Iran, of course, had the right of self-defense. That isn't even a matter of dispute by rational individuals. And also, Hezbollah, the party of God, had every right, and you might argue, every responsibility to come to the defense of Iran, which was being assaulted by two wild beasts. Of course they had that right to come to Iran's defense. In the late 1990s, there was this whole doctrine called R2P, responsibility to protect. It was this liberal doctrine. And basically it meant when international institutions failed in their responsibility to defend countries from genocide, aggression, and so forth, it's the responsibility of others, individual countries, to protect. Well, that's what the party of God, the Hezbollah, did. It fulfilled its responsibility to protect the civilized country of Iran against the wild beasts that were assaulting it. However, it's not really however, it's an in addition. I don't want to say however, that right, and I would say responsibility to come to Iran's defense against the wild beasts, that to me is plain as day. But there is the political consideration. If you do so, Lebanon was going to be destroyed. And they knew it. It was going to be destroyed. During the Israeli genocide in Gaza, Sayed Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the Hezbollah, he desperately tried to carve out a middle path. He wanted to defend, and I believe it was sincere. It was not just strategic calculation. He wanted to defend the people of Gaza from the genocidal assault. But he knew if he went just a little bit too far, Lebanon would be leveled. He tried to carve out that middle path. It didn't work. He couldn't find it. He was a brilliant military tactician and a deeply serious political actor, probably, in my opinion, the most serious political actor on the world stage at that point. And he was in an impossible dilemma. Once he was assassinated, you will recall, Hezbollah ceased its operations in defense of Gaza. It stopped. It realized there was no possibility of a middle path. And now, this time, it looked like the moment of truth for Iran. It was to live or to die. It was the moment of truth. Hezbollah elected the decision to die, to accept the total devastation because they knew a middle path was not possible. And that's where we're at now. Israel is now a madman. It's mad. It didn't get its way with Iran. And so it's flailing now. It's in a state of catatonic lunacy